magazine issue is that that baby was born on planet Earth today and that they were going to live to the age of 142. Not to be outdone, the very next week, the Wall Street Journal, in response to Time Magazine, they did their own issue on it. They wrote an article. They said it's not 142, it's actually age 150. And not to be outdone by that, there is a scientist, an academic researcher out in Palo Alto and Stanford. All he does is study longevity, and he proclaims that there's someone on planet Earth today that's going to live to the age of 200. So we are changing the horizon of potential longevity. And I'm not going to suggest that anyone on this call is going to make it to age 200, but we certainly have to be prepared for a reality where we live in our retirement for 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. We also know the oldest person ever to have lived, verified. Think to yourself, how old do you think that actually is? It was actually a lady by the name of Jean Calment. She was French. She lived to age 122. And what she did after every meal is, one, she'd eat dessert and then she would smoke a cigarette. But that's probably not the best way to make it to age 122. And there are other foreshadowing things with Jean Calment, because if you research Jean Calment, there's a contingent out there that doesn't agree that she actually made it to 122. There's a contingent that feels there's a controversy that she passed away in her 90s and that her daughter stole her identity to continue to get her checks and was the one that actually passed away at age 122. So it's a foreshadowing for this particular presentation, because one of the vulnerabilities that arises with individuals when they live to an advanced age is potential cognitive decline, and with that, the potential vulnerability for fraud. Elder fraud is pervasive. Anyone that has cognitive decline or has known someone who has been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's, they become a big target for financial fraud. And you think about this for a second, those emails you get from Nigerian princes that are dying to give you hundreds of millions of dollars. To you and I, that seems completely outright ridiculous. But for someone who's experiencing even a small amount of cognitive decline, that's actually shown to be very effective. The more ridiculous it is, the more interesting it is for them, the more likely they are to fall for it. There's another individual in the United States. He made it to 112. His name was Richard Overton. He actually lived in Austin, Texas. And he's a very interesting case study as well, because every year the news in Austin, Texas would do a story on Richard Overton. And the story would be Mr. Overton has his birth date. He's now 111, 112 years old. So you think about that for a second. He's on the news. They're giving his name. They're giving his date of birth. Someone got that information. They used it for nefarious purposes, and they completely depleted his financial accounts. He was a major victim of elder fraud. Thankfully, he got the money back because the financial institutions that were involved were brought out into the light, and they indemnified Mr. Overton of his lost money, but it was still extremely expensive for him to continue to live. He'd sit on his patio. He'd smoke Tampa Sweet cigars. He'd smoke 12 of them every single day. He would drink Irish coffee. He made it to 112. Now, unfortunately, there is an expense to that. In order to stay in his house, he was spending $15,000 every single month, $180,000 every single year. It basically wiped him out financially. So Austin, Texas rallied around Mr. Overton, thankfully, and they were able to fund a GoFundMe initiative with $453,000 at his benefit. So that was his retirement plan when he passed away at the age of 112. But he was the oldest veteran in the United States. Really fascinating case study. If you're ever bored, go look up his GoFundMe page. There's a really great video on there. But age, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the number one variable as far as a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia. So you think about people living longer, and you look at age 65. Think about all the people you know that are age 65 or older. 1 in 9 of those individuals will have a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's. Now you take that out further on the age spectrum, and it goes much higher. It is between 2 to 3 individuals at age 85. So think about the individuals that you know are 85 or older. They'll have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So the older you get, the more likely this is. And being prepared for this is a major component of avoiding some of the issues around it. And it might be your loved ones or someone you know, but just understanding that the signs of Alzheimer's, not only are they very troubling, but they're very troubling from a financial aspect. Because as you read through these, one of the things you'll notice very quickly is every single one of them has an issue and creates problems when we're dealing with planning or finances. So a couple of them that we can point out, number 2 and number 8 certainly have some big influence in that area, because challenges in planning or problem solving, if that's what we're doing when we're preparing for our financial lives and you're showing symptoms, and that's one of the first things to go, because where this hits in your brain first, your planning and problem solving, your complex problem solving start to attrit to begin with. But all of these are problematic. Memory loss disrupts daily life. You can't live day to day. That may cause issues with even the ability to generate income. And many Americans are undersaved for retirement, and that might impact their future well-being. Difficulty completing familiar tasks, confusion with time or place. You set a doctor's appointment, you forget where to go. Trouble understanding visual images and spatial relationships. That's a big one when we talk about financial planning, because you think about financial literature and anything you see, and a lot of times there's nice graphs, and those graphs can be very complicated. For someone experiencing cognitive decline, that may be incomprehensible. New problems with words or speaking or writing. We use almost a completely different language in financial services. When we're talking about finance, some of the different jargon that we use can be completely incomprehensible to someone else who's experiencing cognitive decline. Withdrawal from social and work activities, changes in mood or personality. Those last ones are the bedrock of financial exploitation. And in fact, it's not just financial exploitation. There can just be outright senior exploitation for individuals who are experiencing cognitive decline. It's interesting. We used to have a doctor that worked on my staff, and he did a great job of describing Alzheimer's, because the general public just doesn't understand Alzheimer's in general. So he would describe it in 2 pathologies. It's different than most other types of dementia. A lot of people don't realize that Alzheimer's is a specific type of dementia. It just happens to be the most common one. 80% of all dementias are Alzheimer's dementia. So what happens in Alzheimer's that differentiates it from other types of dementia is the way it presents in the brain. There's 2 major precursors. One is called beta amyloid. And the doctor would describe beta amyloid as a gunk because it's a plaque. What ends up happening is that gunk interferes with your brain cells. And you think about your brain cells, anyone know what the name of a brain cell is, the technical scientific jargony term? It's a neuron. Your brain is made up of 100 billion neurons. In order for your brain cells to thrive and live, they need to make connections. And there's another word for those connections. That connection is called a synapse. It is the foundation of all learning and memory. Everything we are contained in those synapses. So that beta amyloid gunk, it ends up covering the brain cell. And the brain cell, when it has that gunk over it, makes difficult to create those and maintain those synapses. And we can't have those synapses. Eventually, your brain cell will atrophy and will inevitably lead to brain cell death. That's the first physiological symptom, is beta amyloid plaques. The second is something called a tau tangle. A tau, the doctor would describe it, it's a protein, but basically he describes it as a straw. You think of it like a straw, it brings nutrients and other items into the brain cell. And when it becomes tangled, it becomes difficult to bring those nutrients and other items into the brain cell. And just like with the beta amyloid plaque, the brain cell, when it has that tau tangle in place, will eventually start to atrophy, and it will promote brain cell death. Now, the crazy thing is, when you think about Alzheimer's and when you're diagnosed, before you start to show any symptoms, 70% of your brain is already affected by Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, they estimate that the symptoms have already been there, or this process has been occurring for about 20 years. So it's pretty incredible to think that your brain is 30% of it is doing the heavy lifting for your brain, and it takes this long for the symptoms to show up. Also, another interesting study was done by the Rush Center in Chicago, and they end up looking at cadavers over a prolonged period of time. This was a 20, 30-year study. They looked at cadavers, they looked at their brains, and what they found is basically every brain that they saw had some level of tau tangles and some level of beta amyloid plaque. However, only a normal percentage of those that they scrutinized had any symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's whatsoever. So what they theorized is those individuals that weren't symptomatic, even though they had the physical signs of Alzheimer's and dementia, being the beta amyloid plaques and the tau tangles, was that they maintained a high level of social engagement, that they continued lifelong learning. They exercised quite a bit. They knew foreign languages. So I think there is some wisdom to think about if you're trying to maintain brain health and maybe stave off Alzheimer's or dementia. And it's no guarantee at all because there are other factors that come into play. Lifestyle, genetics are definitely there, but your lifestyle may help stave off the symptoms, even though you might show the physical signs of dementia. And I think with Alzheimer's in particular, even if you have it in your family and someone's diagnosed, don't freak out about it because it may not be Alzheimer's. There was a coworker of mine whose father-in-law was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They had it in the family. They thought he was the next one to be diagnosed. He goes to the doctor. Turns out it's a vitamin B12 deficiency. He takes his vitamin B12. All of the symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's vanish. There's other things as well. Another coworker of mine, his grandmother ended up calling 911 from her bathroom because she couldn't find her way out of the bathroom. Turns out she had a urinary tract infection. And one of the symptoms of a UTI can be dementia-like symptoms. So not Alzheimer's at all, something she got proper treatment, it cleared up just by itself. Certainly other types of dementias, but again, I think here the bottom line is if you do start to show any of these signs, you or your loved one, going to see a doctor as soon as you can is always a good idea. The treatments that they have available now are worlds different than they used to be. In fact, there's now FDA approved treatments for Alzheimer's.